Okay. Okay, could we have the next slide, please? Okay, uh, our editing office. What do we do, first of all? The research editing office. We look for the usual typos and grammar and spelling and sentence structure and paragraph and so on. But we also more deeply look at the clarity and logic of the academic presentation. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. And these are the kinds of issues that we're going to look for. We're going to try to flag things that might be of some concern to the reviewer. All right, so that's what we're going to focus on today. Next slide, please. Okay, let's just start with the introduction. For NSF, it's called the summary page, and it has an overview, the intellectual merit, and the broader impact. For NIH, a specific aims page. For NEH, a significance and contribution. There's always some kind of a summary page, usually at the beginning of a proposal. This is very, very important. This, this, this gives you an opportunity to establish right away very clearly what you're going to do and to get the reviewer excited about your work. Next slide, please. Okay, that first paragraph. I spend a fair amount of time commenting on first paragraphs. The first paragraph is absolutely essential in my mind. It's there that you grab the reviewer's interest right away, immediately grab their interest. Be specific about the problem that you're going to be solving. Your proposal is going to solve some problem, and the unique and effective way that you're going to solve it. So this is a very brief statement orienting them to the issue that you see and basically how you're going to deal with it. So I think the first paragraph is very, very important. Next slide, please. Okay, now this is a good line. To our knowledge, there are no studies on the effects of thermal stress on meiosis and amphibia. It's a great line, in my opinion, short and to the point. Amphibia are in trouble worldwide. The planet is warming, and meiosis is a key aspect of reproductive biology. The problem here is we want to see this right away. We want to see this at the beginning. If your reviewer or your panel member is reading this on page 8 of a 12-page proposal, that's way too late. So it's a great line if it's very early. So I want to stress the importance of this first paragraph, being very simple, being very clear, and hooking them right away. Next slide, please. I think that if you grab the reviewer's attention right away and get them interested, they have a positive feeling right away about their proposal. So realize that there's a confirmation bias. They're going to be looking for evidences that support their initial perception, which is, hey, this could be a really interesting, important proposal. So that confirmation bias, work with it, all right? Establish what you're doing, why it's important right away, very clearly, very simply. And I think that they're going to be more willing to work with you later on. Well, maybe there's an issue, but okay, I think we can work on that issue. I think it's much more likely to happen if you've got their interest right away. So I spend a fair amount of time thinking about those first few paragraphs of a proposal. Next slide, please. Realize your audience and avoid dense technical jargon of your field. Every now and then I'll get a proposal, and even if I'm not in that field, I think someone who is close to that field is going to have difficulty because there's so much technical jargon here. Realize who your audience is. For most agencies, a panel is going to be made up of individuals. Some might be doing research in your area, in your specific subfield, but there are going to be some members who are not doing research in your specific subfield. So realize that about a panel. You're going to have to, in plain terms, talk about what you're doing, okay, to the educated individual who isn't necessarily doing work in your area. Realize this about agencies. The higher one goes in a decision-making hierarchy as to who gets funded, the further away you're going to be from your specific subfield of interest. So you're writing for the educated individual, avoid all the technical jargon. Every now and then I see one that's just so laden, and it really is off-putting. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, just a note here on career proposals. Excuse me. Many agencies have proposals for young investigators. So that's what I'm talking about, just career capitalized for NSF, but many organizations or agencies have this kind of a program. Uh, my feeling is that your career proposal should look like a career proposal. Many of them that I see across agencies, I wouldn't know that it's a career proposal until toward the end, when all of a sudden there's something tagged on in terms of your educational goals and so on. I think a career proposal should look like one right from the very beginning. I'm thinking about NSF right at the moment, the successful NSF proposals that I've seen, career proposals, will start off with a statement about long-term research goals, but also long-term educational goals, and a statement as to the integration of the two here, right at the beginning of the proposal, so that the reviewer knows that in fact this is a career proposal and feels like a career proposal. It's difficult to place this work in perspective of the development of your career unless you tell them what your long-term research goals are. And more often than not, I do not see this in career proposals. So that's my advice there with career proposals. Make a couple of long-term statements at the beginning to orient your reader. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, the background section, whatever it's called, it's a background section. And this is the place where you explain the logic, give the background on the logic of what you're proposing to do. I have seen statements such as, our work is theory-driven, our methods are. In other words, you say the work is theory-driven, but then go right on to the methods without talking about the theory. Well, what theory? Explain the theory. How are you advancing theory in your field? And I think very importantly, what are the problems or issues or limitations of the dominant existing theory in your field? Very frequently, I'm making this comment. Yes, you're talking that you're doing theory, but what is it? I'm not so sure what it is. And more importantly, how does this differ from what's dominant in the area? And I think this should be a relatively simple thing to do, and it surprises me how often I do not see this. I consider this a missed opportunity, right, to get your reader, your reviewer, or your panel member really interested in your work. Okay, so background section here, just explain this. Next slide, please. Background section again, the place to explain. I've seen things like, our procedures often an efficient and alternative method of determining the likelihood of something such as cell division under thermal stress conditions. First, we place again, alternative to what? What are the limitations? What are the problems with the dominant existing methods? This is the same thing. There's a parallel issue with theory. Same thing with methods. How are your methods better? Quite simply, how are they better? What are the limitations of dominant existing methods? I think this is critically important to be able to do this so that you're placing your work in a broader perspective and clearly indicating what you're bringing to the table here and why you're likely to solve this particular vexing problem. All right, so this background section is very important. Consider converting, whoops, background section is plain. Okay, next slide, please. Converting questions to hypotheses. Every now and then in a proposal, I will see what looks to be, to me, a very reasonable testable hypothesis, but it's not labeled as such. For example, in this proposal, we think that individuals in larger social networks will have larger incomes than those in smaller social networks. This could become, we hypothesize that individuals in larger social networks will have larger incomes than those in smaller social networks. Okay, why? Next slide, please. Why am I suggesting thinking about converting questions to hypotheses? Well, we do research questions in my field. Why hypothesis? I think that just in general, hypotheses come off as being more academically rigorous than simply asking a question. The specificity of a hypothesis, that is a direction, a prediction, a direction of what's going to happen, requires justification. It requires a deeper analysis and presentation of your problem than what I usually see when you just simply present a research question that you're going to be addressing. And I think in some cases, this might offer you a competitive advantage. This apparently more rigorous approach and the specificity and a bit deeper of your analysis, I think may just give you a competitive edge. And getting grants funded is a competitive business. So I think these are the reasons why I suggest you think about this. Um, Many cases, there's no reason why it couldn't be converted and benefit from the potential, benefit from potential reasons that I've suggested here. Okay, next slide, please. Hypotheses. Okay, so we have our hypotheses, or I'm thinking about converting research questions to hypotheses. Be very specific about them, right? We hypothesize that gender diversity in the elementary school classroom will correlate with social skills and academic performance. This is not a specific statement. Your hypothesis has to have a specific direction to it. Now, when we say something like, or we write something like, will correlate, the typical reviewer will read that as a positive correlation. I think that's what we usually default to, is a positive correlation in these situations. When you should just be more exact. We hypothesize that gender diversity in the elementary school classroom will positively correlate with social skills and academic performance. That's a specific statement. Okay, now you may have to justify that. What's the reason for this, and so on. Again, with research questions, you might slip a little bit on that, but here you really have to justify this particular direction that you're stating. Okay, next slide, please. Hypotheses. We'll continue with hypotheses because I often see there are issues, and the hypothesis basically drives everything else. So we spend some time thinking about hypotheses when we're editing. Avoid unintended consequences. Now, this will seem like a harmless enough statement. We hypothesize that compared to those in less diverse social networks, individuals in more diverse social networks will have greater access to information resources and thus greater self-reported quality of life. Now, when I read something like that, I'm reading it very literally. And I'm going to assume then that you as a PI will follow through and do this. Next slide, please. Unintended consequence. I've underlined what it is, the two words, and thus. That suggests a cause and effect relationship, which this PI is not doing at all. And yet, stating it, and thus, this is a cause and effect relationship. It dramatically complicates the proposal. What they're actually doing is, we hypothesize that compared to those in less diverse social networks, individuals in more diverse social networks will have greater access to information and resources and report a higher quality of life. Not that the quality of life is dependent upon the others, but that this is simply going to be a report of a higher quality of life. So there's no cause and effect relationship, which is suggested in the second version. In the first version, and that's exactly what they're doing. But in the first version, they're saying there's going to be a cause and effect relationship, and determining cause and effect relationships when you're is really complicating the analysis, and you're not doing what you say you're going to be doing. So the hypothesis is very important. It has to be specifically stated. Okay, and be mindful of slipping in an extra word or two, which might, in your mind, be harmless enough, but to the reader who's looking at this literally, who hasn't thought about this a lot, but is really looking to your words quite literally, their anticipation can be different than what you're doing, and that's a problem. I don't ever want the reviewer anticipating you're doing something when you're actually not doing it. That's going to disappoint them later on, and we don't want them disappointed later on. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, maintain content and structural consistency. Hypotheses should be consistently stated. I just reviewed a proposal earlier in the week, and this was something that I pointed out that here you're stating something, this is your hypothesis, but back here, look at the wording of the hypothesis. It's not exactly the same. So your hypothesis should be consistently stated. I don't think there's any argument for not doing that. Again, many of us will read very literally word by word the hypothesis because that will drive everything. And so they just really need to be consistently related. Now, I noticed recently in an NIH proposal, I think last week, there was a site there, your specifics aim page, and that's your summary page at the beginning, that basically tells the reviewer what you're going to be doing. But make sure that those aims are specifically that they're consistently stated throughout. And also, when you're getting later on into the proposal and the background, the logic, and you're talking about more detail why you're doing something, and you're labeling your hypotheses, make sure that you're referring back to the aims, uh, because that's the way the reviewers initially thinking about structuring in their mind your work is at these aims. So when you're talking about your detailed approach and the hypotheses that are emerging out of the aims, go back and just note the aims. This is hypothesis one and two. This relates to aim one. This is hypothesis aim four. This relates to aim two. Just remind them so that you're maintaining a consistency of structure in your work. And this will really help the reviewer navigate. If you don't do this, I find I'm doing this all too often. I'm in the approach section. Here's a hypothesis, and I'm wondering how this particular work relates back to that first aim that you were talking about. So this is very simple to do. Just so that's what I mean by constructural consistency. And I see this particularly for NIH. We have got your aims, they're mentioned, and then I never seen aim again. And 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 I think that just disorients the reviewer a bit. It causes them a little bit extra work to go back and think about what might be happening. I don't think that's a wise use of the reviewer's time or effort. Okay, so structural consistency, particularly for NIH, aims, mention them. Okay, next slide, please. Intellectual merit. Now, I don't care who your agency is. NSF requires an intellectual merit paragraph. I don't care who your agency is. You should be discussing at some point the intellectual merit of your work. NSF requires a specific paragraph. So, for those of you thinking about NSF, uh, I often see a very weak intellectual merit. So I did one just very recently, and that was a comment. This is a one-line intellectual merit. It's like, this just is not sufficient. Uh, or I've seen something else, an extremely lengthy section where your background, you'll have, I've seen intellectual merit and background, and then I'll have 2 or 3 pages of the background, and the reviewer is supposed to glean from this when the intellectual merit is. No, they're quite clear about this. They want a brief summary paragraph about the intellectual merit. And so just having your entire background section labeled as intellectual merit is not going to work. You're asking the reviewer to do something. Well, it's really your job to say what the merit is, not the reviewer's to glean what it is from 2 pages of text. I've seen this a couple of times just within the past month, and that's if this is a trend, I think this is a problem. Okay, so what goes in, and I should say that even if I see an intellectual merit paragraph that's a paragraph long, often it fails to summarize the contribution to the literature, excuse me, and it fails to summarize the theoretical contribution that you're making. And these are two things that I think most reviewers for the typical proposal are going to be thinking about. How does this contribute to the literature, and what is the theoretical contribution? I would have to say that of all of the sections, there are 2 sections in particular that I see are problematic in most of the proposals that I look at. One is the very beginning, making it very clear in lay terms what the problem is and how you're going to solve it, and the intellectual merit. these are the two areas that I seem to be commenting a lot about. And I don't know why it's so difficult. Maybe it's because we are so close to what we're doing, our subfield, we're so involved in it that we just think everybody intuitively understands this and we don't really have to explain it. And I don't think that that's the best way to approach this. So the intellectual merit section in NSF where they require it, or in another agency that doesn't require it, I think it's still very useful to have a paragraph that addresses this. Uh, do more than one line. Don't do 2 pages, and summarize the contribution to the literature. What goes in the intellectual merit? Contribution to the literature, theoretical contribution. Okay. Next slide, please. A broader impact statement. Again, NSF requires this, and I think it's a reasonable thing to add to any agency's proposal. But let's look at two of them here. In addition to the health-related consequences, our project will fund 3 graduate students and 1 postdoc. What I'm seeing in the NSF broader impact statement is something about education. The PI is stepping away from the problem that they're solving, and they're simply talking about who's going to be educated here. And sometimes in addition, you will see, and we're reaching out to elementary school students, and I have a high school summer program. Oh, that's wonderful. Okay, that's all wonderful, and agencies just love that kind of outreach, and you should be doing that. But look at the second. In addition to training 3 graduate students and a postdoc, results of our study may suggest treatments for a diversity of serious and life-threatening autoimmune disorders. So at least mentioning what your problem is and what the broader implications of your solution for that problem will be, and not just we're going to educate some undergraduates and a graduate student and a postdoc. Everyone does the former. Almost every proposal that I see, okay, talks about training, and most of them don't do anything else. I don't think that's really covering the broader impact of the work that you're doing. I have no problem with talking about education, okay? But I think you're very wise to go beyond. Oh, and not only solving this problem, our results are maybe useful for these other disciplines too, these other disorders, these other. I think that's really worth doing. Everyone does the former. Almost everybody limits himself to the former version here. So just uh, be broader. Do exactly what they're asking for, the broader impacts. Okay, next slide. Preliminary data are important. Now notice the word data is plural. Data are. The datum is, the data are. They're important, okay? They demonstrate your experience and they suggest likelihood of success. These are things that are going to be in the mind of your panel member, okay? Do you have any experience in this area? Okay, you've got experience in the general area, but have you worked with this method? Have you looked at this particular independent variables? So suggesting the likelihood of success, that's what this is about. Now, try to pull them together. Quite often, all too often, in my opinion, I see preliminary data that are important, but they're spread out throughout the entire proposal. And then I'm trying to, in a way, pull them back together again in some kind of holistic, some kind of gestalt, so holistic view of your experience here. So if you can, try to pull them together. And now sometimes your overall design isn't going to allow that, but if you possibly can, try to package them together in one place as your preliminary data. Um, will the following be effective? Anecdotally, we found that endogenous depression can be effectively treated with, so I use the term anecdote. Okay, the term anecdote just conjures up all kinds of visions of lack of control. You could just say, hey, our pilot work indicates, or we found using this number of subjects that endogenous depression can be effectively treated with whatever. So again, uh, every now and then a term can really can cause your proposal to go wrong. So don't use something like anecdotal, which I have seen. Otherwise, I wouldn't be mentioning it. Um, okay, so preliminary data are very important. Always label them as such. And I think the other issue here is you could say, well, preliminary data. Make sure you're saying our preliminary data or my preliminary data or the team's preliminary data. Uh, Often I've seen mentionings of preliminary data, and I don't know whose it is. Okay. There may be no publication because it's really preliminary. And often I do see the citation of other people's work, which is preliminary to what you're doing. But I think the reviewer, the panel member, is really looking at preliminary data, preliminary work as to what you've done. Okay, and so very clearly and carefully label what is your preliminary work versus what is somebody else's. I'm not saying that someone else's preliminary work isn't important to justifying what you're doing. I just want you to make sure that you're labeling what you have done, what your preliminary, because again, this is largely determining whether you have the experience to be able to solve this particular problem in the way that you want to solve it. Okay, next slide, please. Preliminary results. Be critical. Be critical not only of preliminary results, but well, in the case of proposals, it'd be preliminary results. Be critical. Let's read this. Think about this a second. Using a 1 to 5 Likert scale, like 1 to 5, do you agree, disagree? There is a statistically significant difference, p less than 0.01, between the control group, mean score of 3.59, and the experimental group, mean score of 3.41. Now, I see this every now and then, where there's supposedly a statistically significant difference. But let's look at the score. We've got a Likert of I really agree, I entirely disagree, something like that. A score of 3.59 is really different than a score of 3.41. I'll never be convinced of that. I don't care if you've got 1,000 subjects or 1,000,000 subjects, and that leads to your significance. There's just too much noise here. The idea, the notion of reliability of an individual's scores from one Likert to the next indicates that there's some wiggle room here. 3.59 and 3.41 really are not meaningfully different from one another. And I'm never going to be convinced of that. Even if you give me a p-value, I'm not going to be convinced of that. I've run Likert scales before, and I've seen the data and I've run some reliability on them. And there's some leeway here depending upon the mood of the individual when they're asking the question. So just be critical of your numbers. Be realistic with your numbers. Okay. All right. Next slide, please. Methods. Methods. Avoid statements that suggest the possibility of bias. Boy, do we want to avoid bias. There's just no quicker way to make a panel member or reviewer question your work than that there might be some bias here. We use a floating data collection methodology, which allows us to modify in relation to the results we are receiving. I mean, I've seen this, okay? And you don't want to do this. I mean, there would be no the bias, the possibility of bias is just written all over this. Or our methods are designed to avoid bias by letting the research drive the inquiry. What does this mean? To me, it means that, well, as we see our results, we may change things along, and whoa, one can't do that. You have your hypotheses, you've designed your study. I assume that you've run some pilots, you've got some preliminary data, you're set to go. And you tell us how you're going to do the work. So we don't want to suggest open-ended bias, and that's what's being done, pardon me, in these two particular instances. So I've seen this. I don't see it often, but when I do, it's going to be the PI is going to have serious issues with the reviewers. Okay, next slide, please. Methods should be accurately described. We plan to design a 2-by-2 study. Group A will receive testosterone, Group B will receive estrogen, Group C estradiol, and Group D will be an oil control. Now, this is a reasonable design. Wouldn't have any particular problem with this design, except it's called a 2-by-2 study. and it is not a 2 by 2 study. And I've seen this several times. I even had one individual say, "Hey, it is a 2 by 2," and he presented a paper that had a 2 by 2 like this, labeled as a 2 by 2, and it wasn't a 2 by 2. So I don't know who the reviewers were of that work. Listen now to next slide. I'll show you a 2 by 2. Next slide. This is a 2 by 2 where we have two conditions. We have adult gender and we have race. We have male and female, we have black and white. So we have four separate groups. This is a 2 by 2. That's why it's called a 2 by 2. We've got two main variables and two subvariables, right? Adult gender, male and female, race, black and white. This is a 2 by 2. So the previous design, perfectly fine. Just label it correctly. Just say this is my design. Don't call it a 2 by 2. It's a 2 by 2. Okay. Next slide, please. Watch for careless and seemingly innocent wording. I mentioned this before. Our pilot study will provide the most detailed examination to date of microRNA structure and meiosis in an invertebrate species. Interesting statement. Okay, the problem here is the word pilot. This happened in a proposal, an NSF proposal about a month ago, I guess. This wasn't a pilot study, okay? Far from it, right? Labeling this as a pilot study confused me, and it would certainly confuse the reviewer, the panel member. It's absolutely going to confuse them. All right, wait a second. Hold it, what am I missing? This is pilot work? Whoa, wait. That just really that derails everything, basically, in my opinion. When I read that, I was just stunned. I said, wait a second, why is this a pilot study? What isn't being done? It was the first question that came to mind when I thought that this was, in fact, it was a regular proposal following some previously funded work. It was no way it was a pilot work. That derailed. So you want to be very careful, okay? You could have a seemingly influence, and the PI turned around and said, "Yeah, I don't know. It was just a bad mistake on my part, and I took it out." So just be mindful. Every now and then, a careless word can slip in, but it can have a real impact. Okay, next slide, please. Mediators and moderators. Now that 2 by 2 design that we talked about a minute ago. That's popular because it often shows an interaction effect. That is, the effect of one variable on your whatever process you're interested in could be affected by another variable. So those were called, and still are called, interaction effects. But nowadays, what you're likely to see will be the terms mediator and moderator. And I'll just read, in an experiment, the path between from the independent variable, that thing that's being manipulated, and the dependent variable, the thing that you're interested in looking at, that can be really complex, and it could be influenced by variables. We can call them mediators and moderators. We see confusion routinely between mediator and moderator. Sometimes the mediator is called a moderator, and vice versa. So these are becoming increasingly popular terms. Indeed, this adds a level of sophistication to your analysis. Let's just take a closer look. Let's go to the next slide, please. What is a mediating variable? Okay, you can see your independent variable or your intervention. We often see this with NIH proposals with an intervention. You have a mediator and a dependent variable or an outcome, a health outcome, for example. The mediator is a theoretically driven causal mechanism between the independent and dependent variables. It's the mechanism that causes the independent variable to influence the dependent variable. Okay? Keywords are theory here and a causal link. Another example, we've got a parenting program, and we're hoping that the parenting program will influence the dependent variable, the parenting skills. What might the mediator be? Maybe the motivation to be a better parent might be the mediator. We're looking at some kind of income variable on longevity. What might be the mediating variable between income and longevity? Well, maybe it's the nature of healthcare that the person gets. So The independent variable causes the expression of the mediator, and the mediator causes the expression of the dependent variable. Now, what I often don't see is the theoretical justification. There could be a lot of mediator, aside from just making sure that we're using mediator appropriately. You're going out on a limb and you're saying that that's a causal link between these elements. And rarely do I see a convincing theoretical argument for that element being a mediator. Maybe you want two mediators. In reality, uh, different labs could be positing all kinds of different mediators. So in my mind, if you're going to go this route, if you're going to think about some theoretically driven causal mechanism, then explore the theory underlying why you think this is this causal mechanism. And I tell you now that your work will be above most of the proposals that I see because they don't do this. There's no theoretical justification or very limited theoretical justification. Okay, next slide, please. What is a moderating variable? Well, we have our independent variable. We have our dependent variable. We've got the moderator. In this case, let's say moderator is age. Now, a moderator simply influences the intensity or the degree of the relationship between the independent and the dependent variable. And so quite commonly, we see things like in the method section where you're describing your subjects, we often see age, sex, race. We often see these treated as moderating variables. Relatively simple to offer an argument that these should be moderators. This is very commonly done for these elements, these differences between your subjects. If you wanted to get really tricky about this, okay, more complicated about it, you could talk about when in this axis the moderator has its actions. Is it between the independent variable and the mediator, or is it between the mediator and the dependent variable? I don't see that discussion very often. When I do, I usually notice that because that's a more sophisticated level of analysis. But in general, almost all of the moderators that I see are age, sex, race, something like that, that relates to the diversity amongst your subjects, which is always worth doing. So this is wonderful if you're going to do it. Let's just make sure that we're labeling appropriately the mediator and the moderator. Okay. All right. Next slide, please. I think it's a very good idea to check some examples of successful proposals. If you go to Research Academy down on the lower right-hand corner of that landing page, you'll see that there you can access some proposals that have been funded. Some agencies provide a site where you can go to look at funded proposals. At NEH does, for example, you can go to this site and and take a look. I think that this is a very smart thing to do, particularly if you're a first-time PI, grant writer. I think it's worth taking a look. All right. Next slide, please. Okay, let's talk just briefly about you've seen we look for typos and grammatical issues and sentence structure. We look at all that stuff, but we also look at these issues of the academic presentation itself. So you see some of the things that we look for and see when we're editing. So our policies: we serve ASU faculty, research staff, and postdocs. We do not serve graduate students. We serve faculty, research, and postdocs, right, in any department, in any discipline. Now, for grant proposals, we edit grant proposals that are large and small. We have no dollar figure in the research editing office. We have no minimum dollar figure that you have to reach in order to submit to us. We will edit your proposals, large and small, as long as the PI is an ASU member or the ASU individual is a co-PI. So we'll edit for PIs, we'll edit for co-PIs. So let's say that we've got a proposal you're working with a team and the PI is at the University of Massachusetts and you are a co-PI, that's fine. As long as you are an ASU faculty, research staff, or postdoc, you're a co-PI, we will edit for you. If you're a significant person, that would fall outside of what we can edit. You have to be a PI or a co-PI. Okay. Now, we also edit book proposals, journal manuscripts, and book chapters for ASU first authors. Uh, we, for a long time in this office, were editing white papers. We edit, I don't know of any specifically, maybe someone else can address that, but we do edit white papers. Okay, we do edit white papers. We consider those preliminary. We edit white papers. As far as guidelines, I don't know of any, maybe somebody else does. Let me continue. For a long time, our office was editing just grant proposals and and journal manuscripts, but we weren't reaching out to a portion of the faculty that writes books and book chapters more than they write grant proposals and journal articles. So we now edit book proposals and we edit book chapters. We don't edit entire books first authored by ASU faculty or research postdocs because we're a small office, but we will do book chapters. If you're writing a chapter for somebody else's edited book, some other editor will edit that for you. The other thing is we realize that you're going to have a very difficult time getting funding unless you've published or you've had some performances or journal manuscript paper. So we edit book proposal journal manuscripts. We know that you've got to establish yourself before you can convince a panel that you can really do the work. So we work on a first submitted, first served basis. We don't take reservations. They just don't work. Mainly because you might say you'd have it to us on Tuesday and we're ready. And of course, you're not ready Tuesday because something's happened. And that happens all the time. So first come, first serve. We edit Word files. If you're working with another platform, put it into a PDF and we'll convert it to Word, edit in Word, and send it back to you in Word. There are just too many platforms out there for us to work effectively. We do not create graphics. We will edit, but we will, I should say, we actually will comment on your graphics. We don't actually change your graphics. We don't create graphics in our office, in our editing office, and we don't actually tinker with your graphics. We will comment on your graphics. I'll say that. We prefer 3 days for most grant proposals, but I know that the life can be complicated, and I know that we often run close to a deadline. You should contact me. I will make absolutely every effort at the last minute to at least do a quick read for you. So don't ever feel that oh, Terry and his team, they don't have enough time to don't ever think that. Approach me, and I don't turn proposals away. I might not be at the last minute. I might not be able to spend all the time I would like, but I can do a very quick read and hit the high points. So don't ever feel there's no time. I don't turn away grant proposals because of time. We just don't do that. Okay, so many cases in a few cases where you're working with a large team and a huge center kind of concept, we take more than 3 days, but usually we can do this easily within 2-3 days. Submit through our portal. Here's the address. Any questions you have can come to me. I'm the senior editor, or they can come to Elizabeth. She's the editor associate, and we'll be happy to answer your questions. And if you have any questions, now next slide I think is, do you have any questions? I think it's the question slide next, if I'm not mistaken. Yes. Any questions? This is our the rest of our series. And next, in 2 weeks, Dan Freud, who is the editor over in engineering, will be talking about word choice, grammar, sentence structure, paragraph structure, those aspects, those important aspects of editing. He'll be talking about those. And then proposal graphics, budgeting, supplemental documents, crafting evaluation plans. You can see there are a number of interesting topics that we'll be covering in our proposal development workshop series. So stay tuned for those. And I'd be happy to answer any questions, or I can see that you can send them to me directly. And I'd be happy to respond. Elizabeth would be happy to respond.
Thank you very much, Terry, for sharing your take on proposal editing with us today. And like Terry said, next time in 2 weeks, Daniel will be covering a more traditional editing aspects of editing your proposals. So join us then. If you signed up in Research Academy today, you'll get this video and the slides. And again, feel free to reach out with any questions you might have or with your items to be edited. We'd be happy to take a look at them. I'd like to say thank you again for your patience getting started this afternoon, this morning. And we're glad to have you here today with us. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.